Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another hurricane update here, an overall tropical forecast by Agent Weather Forecast. In this video, we're going to be once again looking at the Eastern Pacific as the MJO continues to bring in tropical systems across the region here. Overall, looking at how active can it be, and overall just tracking the overall peak potential intensity for all these systems. Now, we do have Tropical Storm Hilda likely to become a hurricane, Tropical Depression 9 likely to become a tropical storm, and then now we officially have Invest 91E. So we're starting to get really just a ton of activity here in the Eastern Pacific is going to continue to increase its lead against the Atlantic. However, the MJO will soon move into the Atlantic, and we will see what the MJO brings for the Atlantic and whether it can bring this type of activity in the next few weeks. But without further ado, let's get in the video. So here's looking at the 5-day tropical weather outlook, and this looks completely different to when I did the beginning of my first video yesterday on the Eastern Pacific. We only had 3 AOIs, not TD9 or Hilda, and then right in the middle of my video, TD9 and Hilda formed in the middle of my video. So the refresh on National Hurricane Center. And now Invest 91E has formed, so it's officially an Invest. So we are basically, I believe we're ahead Invest-wise. I think we're only the next invest for the Atlantic is 91L. So I think we're officially ahead invest wise, and overall we obviously are ahead named wise, but invest wise we're finally ahead. So Invest 91E has a 60 to 70%. I believe yesterday it was a 30-60, so we definitely increased a lot for the past 48 hours, and we'll increase really 10% for the next 5 days. So we're now at a high chance of formation or cyclonic formation within the next 5 days. So seeing those scattered, disorganized showers here within a broad area of low in that trough. That potential looks like we're seeing an overall tropical trough kind of forming within this region of the MJO. Continued gradual development of the system is expected, and a tropical depression is likely to form in a couple days before environmental conditions become less conducive for development. This disturbance is expected to move west-northwestward at 10 to 15 miles an hour off the coast or away from the coast of Mexico. Hilda now at 70 miles an hour, which is crazy. Yesterday, this thing was, when it became a tropical storm, it wasn't 40, it was actually 45. But this thing is definitely getting closer, rapidly intensifying. I mean, this thing's getting really close to the actual criteria to rapidly intensify. I believe, it needs 35 miles an hour in 24 hours. And I made a video, at like 4 or 5 o'clock yesterday. But it's expected to become a 100-mile-an-hour Category 2, according to the National Hurricane Center. So this thing's going to get really strong quite quickly. I wouldn't really call it a rapid intensification, but it's really getting there at this point. Minimal central pressure is now at 994 millibars. That is a 9 millibar drop compared to my last video. So this thing's overall just getting a lot more organized of low-level circulation. Obviously, a lot better banding, more high cloud top convection, obviously those cold cloud tops reaching almost negative 8 degrees Celsius. So we're starting to see just a lot of instability and just overall really strong storms. Moving west-northwest at 13 miles an hour. And just that close all 3 storms of these actually. And it's really interesting because a few models are showing once these storms kind of start to weaken that they are showing a Fujiwara effect. And for those who don't know what Fujiwara effect, you're going to find out the definition in a few minutes later in the video. And then Tropical Depression 9E is still sitting at 30 miles an hour, has not changed much compared to yesterday, still sitting at 1,008 millibars. And I believe the GFS is actually really kind of holding back on Tropical Depression 9E's formation. They're kind of really holding it back, and it looks like just overall, looks like models don't have much really confidence in this forming within the next few days at all. But it's definitely something just to keep it close, or at least they don't have it really forming in the next 2 days. But after that, it looks like the models are going to start showing the actual low pressure with some really stronger winds. So here's a look at the Tropical Storm Hilda's discussion number 4. So obviously Hilda is strengthening quickly this morning here. It's getting very close to rapid intensifying. So as you see, the latest look estimates that raising the initial intensity to 55 knots at 12Z, and Hilda continues to organize. The initial intensity is set a little higher at 60 knots for this advisory. So we have obviously heavy strengthening each advisory. The current conditions are quite favorable, and we're seeing really low-level wind shear, really high amounts of moisture, and warm SST should continue to allow Hilda to intensify during the next day or so. In addition, given that Hilda now has a tight inner core. Rapid intensification slash basically RI is a decent possibility, and the ship's RI index now has a 30% chance of that occurring in the next 24 hours. So there is a 30% basically, according to ships, that there could be rapid intensification. So official rapid intensification as this has a more stronger inner core, leading that we can possibly have an eye within the next 24 hours within the storm. In a couple of days, however, decreasing moisture and progressively cooler SST should end the strengthening trend and gradually cause weakening during the remainder of the forecast period. But that's actually when we're looking at the actual possible future jar effect. So those are the actual maximum forecast. So obviously, things that sitting at the initial forecast at this point at 70 miles an hour, but in 12 hours, we're basically looking at by 0Z at 80 miles an hour, so 10-mile increase, and then a 20-mile increase by the next 24 hours. So we're looking at a 30-mile strengthening phase within 24 hours. So if it strengthens just 5 miles an hour more than expected, rapid intensification is definitely very likely, and then it's going to kind of stay at peak for 100 miles an hour, 85 knots, according to the National Hurricane Center. I wouldn't doubt it hits 105, to be honest, considering the overall condition and whether rapid intensification actually occurs sooner or actually just it just goes into a more strengthening phase than expected. And then next 120 hours or so, it'll be 50 miles an hour. So it's going to start gradually weakening, possibly 50 mile an hour each maybe 12 hours possibly, according to the National Hurricane Center. So here's a further IR forecast satellite imagery here on the whole Eastern Pacific, because if we look at the whole Eastern Pacific, we can just see all three storms kind of in a linear mode. They're kind of just really kind of adjacent to each other, basically. They're really looking quite good. You see a whole line. It's exactly what we're seeing here. That large kind of moisture wave here. This is an MJO. We have a huge moisture bubble. There's really no dry air. Actually, there's a little bit dry air, I believe, kind of towards the north. At this point, there is some dry air up to the north, and that's why as these storms go, kind of go west-northwestward, as the MJO obviously goes to the eastward, that moisture is going to kind of go the opposite direction as the storm itself. So we're going to be seeing some drier, possibly encountering these storms later on. But look at Hilda, obviously the best looking storm at this point. Has a really strong and strengthening inner core. It looks like we're trying to get a, looks like an eye wall start to, or at least portions of the eye wall starting to develop. Because we're definitely going to be seeing an eye wall with this system looking at 100 miles an hour, possibly even 105 miles an hour, which is a low end category 2. There we have child depression. 9. It's definitely has a lot of convection going on here. It looks like we're starting to see a little bit latest update that we are starting to see some more developing convection within the past few runs. And that as well, there we have Invest 91E of scattered convection, scattered thunderstorms around an area of low pressure. This as well is starting to get its act together. However, models for some reason as well are really inconsistent with 91E's development. The main thing is really these two systems, TD9 and Tropical Storm Hilda. Let's actually get a better look here at the actual Tropical Storm Hilda's convection forecast. As you can actually see, we're getting very, very close to possibly negative 85 degrees Celsius cloud tops within the actual region of the eastern quadrant. So we're starting to see a lot, and I mean a lot of convection really blowing up here. I wouldn't really call this a diurnal maximum because it's been quite consistent. It's just something like the latest, trend. It looks like the low pressure is kind of towards the northwest of the actual main convection itself, and that's why I'm trying to say that there's a chance that it's possibly developing an eye wall, and it may look like it's trying to maybe find a new center, just considering how it's kind of reducing in size itself, and it looks like we're starting to see an actual new area of convection bursts, and that can allow for maybe this low pressure to be found a little bit further south than what it is now. But overall, it looks like we're going to start seeing, possibly by tonight, most likely we can start seeing some higher convection totals, and obviously colder cloud tops kind of fully rotate around this actual low pressure kind of clockwise, and that will allow for a possibly a fully closed inner core, allowing for that chance for rapid intensification within the system. Here's a look here at Tropical Storm Hilda's forecasted cone, and obviously area of possibly max winds. This is just the overall cone. So we have a pretty large wind field tropical storm wise. I mean, this is actually a pretty good looking tropical storm considering how it wasn't even one 24 hours ago. It has a super large wind field, especially kind of towards the northern quadrant, eastern quadrant. It's exactly where we're seeing that most amount of convection kind of right here. We're still lacking a little bit of those tropical storm wind fields to the southwest of the actual low pressure itself, which is obviously not too uncommon. We see that a lot. So obviously looking to get up to 80 miles an hour by the next 12 hours, and then eventually getting up to nearly 100 miles an hour by possibly Monday. So that's definitely quite interesting there. I'm going to stay at a hurricane until basically around Wednesday, and then it's going to start going through a rapid weakening phase and just kind of really falling apart as conditions just diminish. So the actual 12Z intensity guidance here, actually I think 18Z does come out in like an hour or so, so I kind of made this video a little too early. But 12Z, I bet 18Z is going to have a lot more towards category 2. But 12Z though, we have a lot of the majority getting this to up to at least possibly 80 knots, which is basically a very, very, very high in category 1. And then some getting into maybe 75 knots, which is basically around 85-ish miles an hour. Still a pretty strong category 1, but I bet you by 18Z, a majority will start getting towards low-end category 2, possibly 85 knots, which is basically 100 miles an hour. It's exactly what the National Air Center is saying. So 12Z looks like to be a little bit on a weakening trend. Obviously, 18Z is typically the best run as well, just for more accurate runs and just better consistency within the models. So obviously, they have it at 55 knots, and this is obviously at 60 knots now. So like I said, it's kind of a little bit weaker, so that's going to kind of be a pretty big difference. But overall, even though the winds isn't accurate with this, we can still look at the actual weakening time frame. Looks like we're looking at anywhere from 84 to maybe 96 hours to start seeing this get back once again to a tropical storm. Let's now look at tropical depression, 9's cone, and just forecast and overall expected strength. And obviously this is likely to become or stay at a tropical depression until Sunday in the evening hours, and then by possibly we may see a strong diurnal maximum allowing for some strengthening, and that can help get it to a tropical storm by the morning hours. So we will be seeing, let's see, that will possibly be let's see here, that'll possibly be, let's see, a tropical storm Ignacio. I believe that's the next storm. Ignacio is the next storm for the Eastern Pacific. So we're already at letter I, which is actually not bad at all. So we already got Andres, Blanca, Carlos, Dolores, Enrique, Felicia, Girno, now Hilda. So we're definitely seeing a really good EPAC season. Let's now get a look here at the actual tropical depression model intensity guidance. Like I did say, models were kind of really, I guess, holding back within the actual this becoming a tropical storm, forming into a tropical storm. I kind of said basically before 40 hours is really, really unlikely, just according to the overall models, and I've obviously as well as 12Z as well as kind of agreeing here. Really, maybe 60-ish hours is when we can possibly see Ignacio within tropical depression 9E, but the GFS is really holding back a lot. You're going to see what I mean here. 12Z GFS, I get to say 12Z is kind of a little bit off when it comes to these storms now, since we've kind of seen a strengthening phase within them. But it's like we're going to really see what 18Z says though. And then last but not least, on the intensity guidance, we have the latest and first advisory, I believe, or I think this may be the second update within Invest 91E. And we only have one getting this to a category 1, to a tropical storm. Models as well are really rarely kind of showing this even forming at all, according to the GFS. And I believe even European is really starting to hesitate within showing 91E form as well. So we actually may not get to letter J, Jimena, within the next few days, actually. It would be really crazy if we get 3 storms in the Pacific within like a 3-day time period from an MJO, because obviously that wouldn't be 3-day time period, because that means 91E would have to form near the time period during TD9. So it would be crazy if we see 3 storms form in 5 days from an MJO in the Eastern Pacific. That'd be crazy if we can get to Jimena this pretty early. Obviously, Eastern Pacific is far ahead, and it'll be further ahead if Invest 91E were to form, which is still not looking super duper likely. For those who are wondering why is the Eastern Pacific all of a sudden blowing up, and for those, obviously I said in the very beginning about MJO, but for those who don't really know what MJO is, it's basically Madden-Julian oscillation, which basically seeing it's basically the MJO is basically an eastward motion of winds, clouds, storms, and it's basically lasts in a general ocean or large region, and it kind of sticks around for anywhere from 30 days to 60 days. So they're not the fastest moving, which is why you can see a ton of storms come in within a month or so time period within the MJOs. We've actually seen that before. This one, it's going to start within the next week or so. Actually, the MJO will push into the western Atlantic and then move into the central Atlantic by late August. And that's why August can very well be a pretty active month. We did not have the MJO in the July time period. We had a Kelvin wave though in early July, which allowed for Elsa to form. After that, the Kelvin wave moved over Africa into the eventually Arabian Sea and overall. And at that point, the MJO was kind of in place near the Indian Ocean. And now in late July, it's now in the Western Pacific, or in late/mid July, moves into the Western Pacific, and now it's in the Eastern Pacific. So we're starting to see really nice negative VPUs. It's basically kind of saying overall we're seeing a lot of divergence, and that's going to be really, really good for development, as well as seeing some really good easterly winds within these negative digits that we want to see. Those negative digits basically indicates easterly winds, and then these reds kind of signify overall looking at basically westerly wind, which is not associated with a Kelvin wave or MJO, and as well overall seeing a good amount of sinking air here and a lot of rising air here as well, which will help gradually develop systems and overall help them out quite a bit. So that's exactly why the Eastern Pacific is also blowing up. And then if we actually want to look at the actual the velocity potential anomalies, we're kind of seeing that we're looking at really good amounts here of divergence, and overall those nice zonal winds, those negative zonal winds, which is obviously indicating those easterly winds. And you see this is where we are now, basically July 31st, and this is looking at from 0 to basically back once again to 0. So obviously we're looking at anywhere from 120 west, which is basically the Eastern Pacific, and where we're watching out for, and you kind of see we're seeing a lot of divergence, a lot of sinking air, and those nice negative zonal winds, which is basically zonal winds is basically straight winds basically that are moving eastward, those negative digits. So we're seeing obviously basically a I guess a monsoon front, which is basically what you typically see in a either a Kelvin wave or an AEW or a MJO, which is exactly what we're seeing there associated with the MJO. So lastly, let's not look at the actual models. Obviously, the GFS is kind of behind on this just by a few millibars when it comes to Hilda, because they have it at 995 millibars at this point. But like I did say, the GFS is really kind of holding back a little bit on both 91E and as well TD9 development. You kind of see really nothing, really see small little low pressure right there, but it's very, very weak here actually, and that's within 39 hours as well. You just see just Hilda really see a little small low pressure there as well, very weak trough. Again, really the pressure is going to be not too low. So actually look at pressure. You see the pressure is not that low at all. It's basically near 1,010, 1,008 millibars, which is obviously not bad for an actual invest, but considering that if we want to see development, it'll have to be around the next 2 days or 3 days, and it's obviously not looking too good for 91E. And it's like 91E just looks like it just kind of dissipates. I wouldn't call it Fujiwara. That's not Fujiwara basically. That's the low right there. Very weak trough there. But look at TD9. I mean, this is 63 hours. It's basically see pressure. It's basically around 1,004-ish, 1,000 millibars. But there's really no no winds associated with it, which we'll also later on. Let's look at the 10-meter winds and knots, and you can see maybe 30-ish knots, which is basically still at 35 miles an hour, which is obviously top depression. But this is what I'm talking about now, Fujiwara. So Fujiwara is basically when you have kind of two storms that are... Fujiwara is likely when there's two systems within 1,000 miles of each other. And obviously this is way, way, way closer than 1,000 miles. This is basically maybe 200 miles away from these two systems. And you can obviously typically with Fujiwara, when two storms kind of merge and make a I wouldn't call superstorm, but they merge together and they make a larger storm and a stronger storm. It's very rare. It's not common at all, but obviously MJO is when you kind of have enclosed areas of moisture, and that's where you see those best chances of low pressures forming. Fewer charges become a little bit more likely instead of when you see just regular, I guess, African easterly waves that are kind of coming off very far apart. Fewer jars really unlikely when it comes to those separate fronts or the separate monsoon fronts. Uh, but basically, overall, it's not, I wouldn't say likely because it's still very rare in cases, but Fujiwara is models have been consistent with showing Fujiwara effects between Tropical Depression 9 and Tropical Depression 9 and Tropical Storm Hilda. You can see right there. Typically, the strongest storms are the ones that kind of become the magnet and attract the other low pressure. And typically, what you see with Fujiwara is that you kind of see the counterclockwise flow kind of allow that second system to kind of follow that counterclockwise flow to the point where it gets very close. You can kind of see that. You can see that there's Tropical Depression 9, and it kind of merges right there before Hilda becomes post-tropical. So it's going to happen when they're most likely very weak tropical storm Hilda. It won't be merging as a hurricane, making a super system, but it's going to possibly do Fujiwara when Hilda's actually weakening itself. But that's definitely really interesting that we're looking at that. I mean, that's just really crazy though. But let's now go look at the actual vorticity. Obviously, really nice amount of vorticity within Hilda. Looks like we're going to start seeing some really nice deep core vorticity, nice counterclockwise flow overall, some really strong storms. MBS 91 isn't looking good, neither even Tropical Depression 9, just really unorganized vorticity. And then there you see that Fujiwara effect happening again. It kind of just really connects, and by the time it actually weakens. And last but not least, let's look at the H-Warp, see what the H-Warp wants to have. H-Warp actually wants to get this to as low as possibly 971 millibars by the time we get towards August 2nd at around basically Monday morning, which is actually when we're expecting to see 100 miles an hour. But they want to get up to 972 millibars. So let's actually look at the actual wind speed though. I think H-Warp is actually quite reasonable. I think they're really reasonable within this system. You're about to see why. So let's look at the actual wind speed. What they have. So they have basically 61 miles an hour, which is obviously weaker than what it is now. But let's now look at 15 hours, 84 miles an hour. It's not unreasonable because this is 70 now, and they want actually the National Hurricane Center wants it within the next 12 hours. They want to have 80. So this is actually not unreasonable at all. Typically the H-Warp goes overboard, but they want to have max wind speeds at 102 miles an hour basically. And that's basically 2 miles an hour stronger than what the National Hurricane Center wants. So I think this is definitely very, very reasonable and definitely interesting.